Slavery was invented. We often don't think of it that way, but it was created step by step and law by law. At first, somebody could be enslaved only for a certain period of time, but they changed that. And it used to be that the children of people who were enslaved, they wouldn't be enslaved, they were free. Well, they changed that. And used to be they would give rewards to people if they caught somebody who escaped. But that wasn't working because so many people were escaping slavery. So they tried punishment. In 1850, they passed the Fugitive Slave Law. Now it said if you knew if somebody was escaping and you didn't assist in their arrest, you'd get fined. And if you helped, you'd get fined and you would be sent to jail. But one town, Oberlin, Ohio, said, we're not doing it. Now, it had been known as a pretty progressive town. They refused to celebrate the 4th of July. They said, how can we celebrate Independence Day when we have people on our land who are enslaved? And they were the first folks to send men, women, and blacks to college. And they were the first folks that, had more, everybody could vote there before that was true in the rest of the nation. So some people said that the Civil War almost started earlier in Oberlin because of something that happened in 1857. Here's what happened. There were 2 people who were enslaved down in Kentucky. They were just a quarter mile, 2 blocks away from the Ohio River that separated the South and the North, but they had been enslaved by a man named John Bacon. And their names were John and Dinah, and they wanted to be free. Now, this was very risky business because, of course, you could be shot, killed, maimed, whatever, trying to escape. And that was kind of the lucky ones because if they caught you and brought you back, your life could really be hard. But John and Dinah didn't care. They were 2 cousins who wanted to be free, and they saw their chance one night when John Bacon went off to visit family. And the man who was put in charge to watch all the enslaved people on that plantation kind of had a reputation of being somebody who fell asleep on the job. Well, word spread that he was asleep, and John and Dinah, they crept into the barn. Now, can you imagine how hard it was to keep 2 horses quiet? But they managed to get the horses out of that barn, and then they rode in the opposite direction. Now, it wasn't that they didn't know where they were. Now, this happened to a lot of people. Of course, you get captured in Africa, you get brought here. It's not like somebody showed you a map of where you were. But it wasn't because they didn't know where they were. They were doing something very brave. They were going the opposite direction to go get their friend Frank, who also wanted to escape. They picked him up, 2 on one horse, 1 on the other. They raced back to the Ohio River, got across it with no problem because it was winter and the river was frozen. But when they got to the other side, they couldn't find the path up that bank. Now remember, this was back in the 1800s. There were no electric street lights or whatever. Pitch darkness, scrambling all night in the freezing cold. They didn't have coats or anything. That was one of the ways they kept people who were enslaved from running as they take their shoes or heavy coats at night. Scrambling, trying to find the path up, couldn't find it. And they knew if the sun came up that morning, oh my goodness, they'd be so easy to spot. 3 people, 2 horses on the bank. So they kept all night, and finally they find their way up. And then John did something to me that's kind of amazing. He said, nobody can own me, but John Bacon owned these horses. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'd been working free all my life and my mom had been and my grandma had been, I'd be thinking these horses belonged to me. But he hit them on the rump and sent them home. And then they went on their way. They split up. Dinah went with somebody from the Underground Railroad, and Frank and John headed up to Oberlin. Now, the plan was they'd be in Oberlin, wait for Lake Erie to thaw, and move up to Canada. But when they got to Oberlin, it must have felt like a fantasy land. There were black storekeepers. There were black people going to college. They got a job with a farmer getting paid $1 a day. Well, after working for free, that seemed like a lot. So they decided to stay, and John took the name John Price. But what he didn't know is that slave catchers had been sent after them. A man named Anderson Jennings was a professional slave catcher. He could get as much as $1,000, a lot of money back then, if he caught somebody. So not everybody was progressive in Oberlin. He found a family he knew that he could count on, the Boytons, and this is a great name. He got their son, 10-year-old boy, Shakespeare Boyton, gave him $20 and told him to go pick up John and Frank. So Shakespeare took his buggy, went to the farm where John was working, said, hey, my dad's paying $2 a day, twice as much, $2 a day, come and help. And now John, he was a loyal friend. He said, no, my friend Frank is kind of sick, I can't go. Oh, good. But then he said, but I know somebody who really needs the money. I'll show you where he's staying. And he got in the buggy with Shakespeare, and Shakespeare started driving the wrong way, and John's like, no, my friend's over here. Drive him into the woods, and all of a sudden another buggy comes tromping up behind. Men jump out with rifles, grab John, tie him up, throw him in their buggy, and off they go. Now, Anderson Jennings and his men knew they weren't going to try to get on the train at Oberlin. That town was not a friendly place for them, so they went 9 miles south to Wellington. And they rented the third floor like attic because it wasn't coming, a night train was coming, and they had to wait. They could see from that vantage point if anybody was coming, if there was any trouble. Well, luckily, an Oberlin student saw all this going on, saw John get captured, went running into town. They've got John Price, hurry! People went out on horses, on their buggies. They went to the livery station and rented some. They went out on foot to go the 9 miles to Wellington. And imagine Anderson Jennings' surprise when he saw 100 people show up in front of that Wadsworth Hotel where they were waiting. And then 200 people in the square. 300, 400, 500, 600, 700 people came. Now remember, all these people were breaking the federal law, the fugitive slave law. All of them could be imprisoned. But they were shouting, give us John Price, give us John Price. Well, Anderson Jennings got kind of nervous. He sent out one of his men to the telegraph office to send a wire sending for soldiers, because this was a federal law. Send for the federal soldiers to come and help them. And the rumors spread in the crowd. The soldiers are coming. We better make our move. So one group went up the front of the hotel, the other one up the back, but now it was kind of light and they couldn't see where they're going. All of a sudden the group that went up the back saw Anderson Jennings' man there with rifles. And one of the Oberlin men took his rifle ready to shot, and just at that moment when the Oberlin men hit that rifle, and it hit, the bullet went right up into the ceiling. And he said, no violence. Now this was an African-American man who had the lashes down his back to prove that he could have been out for revenge. But instead he said no violence. But that was enough to scare the Jennings men. They went running off. That group went up the back steps. They met the group that had gone up the top steps. Remember, there was no lights, electricity back then. It was getting dark, so it was kind of like, I don't know if you ever saw the old comedies, the Keystone Cops. They're kind of running into each other, trying to figure out where's the room that John might be in. And just at that moment, Anderson Jennings pulled his head back and looked through a hole where an old stovepipe had been, trying to see out in the dark of the hall who's out there, who's making that noise. Just when one of the Oberlin men took his rifle, put it down that hole, and bonked Jennings on the head. He fell onto the ground and let go the rope he was holding. That's all they were using to close the door. There wasn't even a lock. The door swung open. The Oberlin people came in. There was all this confusion, but they knew they had John when they heard the cheers outside. Yay, John! The whole crowd cheering. And they whisked him off. We don't know where exactly. Some say to Canada. I like to think he and his cousin Dinah found each other. Well, the federal marshals came marching into town. They arrested 37 people, legislators, farmers, 74-year-old man. None of them had previous records except one who had been fined $1 for smoking a cigar on the Oberlin street. And when they came into the classroom to arrest one of the teachers, this little first grader stood up and he said, "Why, our teacher has more goodness in his little finger than your entire carcass." And they jailed these people, 37 Oberlin people, at maximum security in Cleveland. They said, we've got to make an example. These Oberlin people have always been pushing against the laws. We've got to make an example. But it backfired. 4,000 people came to visit them. School children wrote letters. People wrote articles calling them the new patriots. And when Jennings came up to that trial, which completely rigged, by the way, you can't believe what they did in that trial. When Anderson Jennings, the slave catcher, came up to that trial, the Oberlin people kidnapped him. And they made him sign something, said he'd never come trying to catch enslaved people who had previously been enslaved before. And after that, the government's case just completely fell apart. And they had to release them. And when they did, bands met them. People played Yankee Doodle Dandy. Cannons were shot off. They got on the train in Cleveland. They went to Oberlin. And when they got there, this little town of under 2,000 people, there were almost 5,000 people there to greet them. And they had a huge rally. And at that rally, everybody stood up and took a pledge that nobody would ever be caught in their town again. And nobody ever was. That's the kind of people we come from. That's our legacy. We come from a group of people who have always stood up for each other. People who said they would risk anything for freedom. People who have refused to be divided and said, no, we are one American family.